How old is the Earth? You'd think that this would be a straightforward question. That a question like this is just kind of a statement of fact, but anytime we get to a question that might overlap with science and the church, things can get complicated. Back about 400 years ago, there was an Irish archbishop who did some calculations based on the genealogies he found in Scripture and decided that the Earth must have been created in 4004 BC. And while there are others who have done similar calculations, his became very popular, and so the tradition has been for a long time that the Earth must be around 6,000 years old. Scientists in the 1800s started to understand that the Earth was much, much, much older. Originally, physicists arguing that it was 20 to 100 million years, not just 6,000. And then eventually leading, with the discovery of radiometric dating, to estimating that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. It seems inevitable that there is a conflict between faith and science, that we must choose the truths of Scripture, or at least what the tradition says the Scripture says, or we must choose between science, which is kind of this just vague combination of discoveries and a belief in something. It's hard to nail down what exactly is this science that we are supposed to choose over faith. And then there is Francis Collins. He is currently the director of the National Institutes of Health, one of the largest biomedical research organizations in the world. Right now, researching the coronavirus, how to treat it, vaccines, and what we can do to prevent its spread. But before that, he directed the Human Genome Project as part of the National Institutes of Health, which brought together an international group of scientists to map out human DNA for the first time, which was completed in 2003. He is the only director of the National Institutes of Health, from what I understand, who has served under different presidential administrations. And on top of all of that, being one of the world's premier scientific minds, he is also a devout follower of Jesus. We are continuing this week to explore different disconnects between the church and the modern world. I've been using a book called You Lost Me by David Kinnaman, who's a researcher who has been looking into why is it that so many people are leaving the church, especially younger generations. And he offers up 6 reasons. Last week, we talked about the first reason, which is that churches tend to be sheltered or overprotective. And I argued that the scriptures tell us not necessarily to be sheltered or overprotective, but instead to practice discernment. And today I want to look at this claim that he brings up that people view the church as anti-science. Francis Collins, in a speech that he was giving once, I think said that 60% of people in America view a conflict between religion and science, between the Christian faith and the scientific community. But does it need to be that kind of a conflict? Is there a different approach? And how are we as Christians to engage with our modern scientific world? First, I think to help is to define what we mean by science, because there's really 2 different things going on that we can call science. The first is what science ought to be. It is the experimenting, the collection of data, the logic and the reasoning that is used to try and understand and observe how the world works. It is the various processes that have been put into place to try and come up with theories that explain what is going on in the world, inside us as people, in the animal kingdom, at the level of the atom or at the expanse of the universe. And these processes don't have behind them some sort of philosophical or theological agenda. There's not some sort of political gain being sought. It is simply processes meant to understand reality. Now, often there is a reason for why certain experiments or certain topics are being explored, whether it's trying to go out into space or right now trying to cure a specific disease. So there's often a purpose to this scientific exploration, but there's not necessarily a political or theological agenda behind it. In contrast, there's this other thing that is often called science. Andrew Root, the well-known professor of youth ministry at Luther Seminary in Minnesota, talks about this as the social practice of science. It is not just scientific findings or the various scientific fields, but it is this belief that we live in a naturalistic universe, that there is no purpose, there is no order, it is just a bunch of random matter that has come together. And that if we are mature, educated, intellectual individuals, we will come to discover that the only rational thought when it comes to the universe is that there is no point to it, that there is nothing behind it, that there is no God. And as we discover more and more from science, there is less and less unexplained, and so we don't need God to fill in those gaps. This second thing is not science, but is in itself a belief system. It is a belief that we have discovered enough to say that belief in a God is immature or wrong. Interestingly, Francis Collins and others look at this kind of atheistic belief as the least rational approach. Because how can you prove that something does not exist? You see, the error that is made here is it is a caricature of what we believe is God. We do not, as Christians, believe that God is an answer to the things we don't understand. God is not a concept. God is not this thing that fills in the gaps for the things we don't get. If we could understand all that there is, we would discover at its core a creator who set the universe in motion. And for many people, myself included, that seems to be a more rational belief than saying that there is no point, it is completely random, there is nothing behind the universe. But what do we do with questions like the age of the earth? When there seems to be a strong tradition in the faith that conflicts with strong evidence from scientific discovery. And for this, I want us to turn to the scriptures, to Paul's letter to the Corinthians, to a passage that many of us are familiar with, even those outside the church. It is the love chapter, often read at weddings, the one that says love is patient, love is kind. And at this point in Paul's letter, he's dealing with a church that is messed up. The church in Corinth has problems. And he's been dealing with one problem after another. And then he gets to this point where he is trying to explain to the Corinthians that just because they have certain gifts or talents doesn't make them better than everyone else. And I want to pull out just a few verses here in 1 Corinthians 13. Towards the beginning, it says, "If I speak with the tongue of men or of angels but have not love, I am nothing but a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I am nothing." Skipping ahead, verse 8, "Love never ceases, but as for prophecies, they will come to an end. Tongues, they will cease. Knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, we prophesy only in part, but when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now, we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. Paul is trying to explain to the Corinthians that they think they know everything. They think that they are so smart. They think that they are so gifted, but they only know in part. They only see in part. Even the Apostle Paul, the first missionary, the person who wrote half of the New Testament, only knew part of what is going on. And this is where I would like us to start as Christians, is a recognition that we are not going to know everything. God has no obligation to explain the world and the universe to us. And maybe there is a clear explanation for this particular age of the earth question, but there are dozens and dozens of questions. And there continue to be new scientific discoveries that may or may not conflict with the traditions of the church. And so it is more important for me, rather than answering this one question, to focus on how do we approach these questions as they arise. And the first thing is a recognition that we are not always going to have an answer. That we might not be able to neatly tie up some kind of seeming contradiction. And that is okay. If you have never thought about this conflict between the age of the earth and the Christian tradition and in science, then you might not have a response right now. And that's perfectly understandable. There is no need for us as Christians to become defensive, argumentative, and just start to try and trip over our words to explain why this isn't a conflict, or why science is wrong, or why everybody should believe the way I already believe. I think the first thing is we need to recognize that we are not going to know everything, and it is okay to just say, you know what, I don't know, I haven't thought about it before. Why don't you go talk to the pastor? Or I'll go read up on it and come back to you. Or I've got a friend who's really into this topic. Maybe you can talk with them. There is no need for us to get defensive or combative when it comes to scientific questions and scientific discoveries. Second is that we should respond in love. This whole passage is kind of the culmination of the letter of 1 Corinthians. Paul is saying it doesn't matter how smart you are or how much stuff you know. If you do not have love, it doesn't matter. We need to practice compassion for other people. There's a well-known environmental lawyer who's been working in that area for decades, named Gus Speth. And he's famous for saying that he used to think that the greatest threats to our world, greatest threats to the environment of the world, were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. But instead, he has come to believe that the real problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. That what the world needs now is not necessarily more science, but it needs a cultural and spiritual transformation. And I could not agree more. We live in a world where prior to the pandemic, we had the technology and the resources to end homelessness and poverty, I think, around the globe. With the pandemic, it was a new disease. It's something we haven't faced before. But there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who could have been alive today if it wasn't for the selfishness and apathy and conflict that we have allowed to enter into our society. And there are reasons why people are skeptical of the medical community or the scientific community. There are reasons why people are concerned about taking certain precautions versus others. And you know what? Sometimes It's legitimate, and sometimes it seems absurd. And I know for those of us who are vaccinated, who do wear our masks, that it can be hard to have empathy for those who do not, or at least it can be hard to understand, but we as Christians are called to love them anyways. And if we as Christians had been prioritizing over the past several years love and compassion rather than petty political arguments and debates and digging our heels in, then we wouldn't be in the situation we are now, where we are back to seeing a rise in COVID cases similar to how it was last year, where we are dealing with the hospitals in our region being full, not necessarily going to be able to take in all of the patients that need a hospital visit. This conflict that seems to exist between faith and science can cost lives. And what we need is a cultural and spiritual transformation. What we need is to love as Paul describes it. Francis Collins won the Templeton Prize last year for his efforts to bring together faith and science. And in that acceptance speech, he talked about how we need to recommit ourselves to loving our neighbor. And not just loving our neighbor, but also loving our enemy, praying for those who persecute us. And he said that it is really hard to hate someone who you have been praying for. And so today I hope as we go out and if we come across this conflict in our lives, if we come across a situation where there seems to be tension between our faith and the scientific community, or skepticism of doctors and medical advice, or you're a person outside of the church who looks in judgment on the church, let me offer to all of us that we don't know everything. There is no guarantee we are going to ever understand everything, and we should all practice humility, knowing that just because we don't understand it, just because we can't personally reconcile it, doesn't mean it cannot be answered. Does not mean that God doesn't already see it and already have a response. And two, if it is not our task to know everything and beat people over the head with the right answer, then what is our task? Our task is to love, as Paul describes it. Because people, both inside the church and outside the church, recognize that we are the most technologically and scientifically advanced country in the history of the world. We have more resources than any group of people have ever had, and yet we have such conflict and anger and pain in our society. I don't think that the biggest struggle we have is that we need to push for more scientific advancement. I think that what we need to do is that we need to take seriously Jesus' call to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if you are not in the church and you've kept your distance from the church because you have seen it as anti-science, let me invite you to consider that there is another way. There are scientists like Francis Collins and many others who are devout Christians, who've written books, websites, had talks that can help you to kind of unpack some of those ideas that you cannot be a serious person of science and a serious person following Jesus, because I do believe that that is possible. And so I invite you today to consider that possibility, that there does not need to be this conflict between science and faith, and certainly the church isn't against science. Let us go out today recommitting ourselves to loving our neighbor as Jesus told us, as Francis Collins has suggested us, and as we as Christians ought to be doing every day of our life.